Welcome to Evangelicalish, where we discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of the American evangelical church, deconstruction, faith, and God's love through it all.
Remember, if you're listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any of your favorite podcast platforms, let us invite you to join the live interactive recording most Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific on the Evangelicalish YouTube channel.
Now to this episode of Evangelical-ish.
Well, hello, everyone.
Oh, I'm not raptured. I'm here.
Yep, Paul doing the disappearing act for a moment.
I just had that idea at the last minute. I should have hung like my shirt on the chair and disappeared.
Opportunity missed. Maybe the next eclipse you can do that. If you're not raptured for real, because you never know.
I was actually sort of anxious for our evangelical friends to be raptured, and then maybe the earth would, be a little bit better place to live.
I personally love the idea of like the ultimate plot twist. Like if being raptured is based on being a good person, that everybody else gets raptured and they get left behind. Like I just think that would be fun.
Well, they would just declare it was demons that had done it all and keep going.
Yeah, they'd find some way. I mean, the rapture groups I've seen, obviously the rapture did not happen. We are here. The eclipse came and went. And, there's some people that are doubling down that are saying, hey, it's still a sign of the end times. The rapture is still imminent. We don't know the day or time. And probably that's why, because too many people were saying it. And then, there's actually been quite a bit of infighting in these rapture Facebook groups.
Oh, they're going after each other. Huh?
Yeah. They're like, y'all need to stop saying a date. It makes us look like fools. They're like, and then there's some people grieving. Like, I just don't understand why there's so many mockers. Even Christians are mocking us. And I'm like, well, I mean, yeah.
It's another rapture date bites the dust. And yet still they will hang on to their, is it preterist? Premillennialist and preterist and all of that stance. I always say that we will pry their Antichrist from their cold dead hands.
Yeah, whichever Democrat is currently making a bid for the White House is the Antichrist of the day, or the Pope. It's usually one of the two.
I actually absolutely love, though, particularly on our evangelicalish group page, everybody's like checking in, left behind, still here.
Yeah,
didn't go.
I know. I realize now me making like a proof of life photo to say that I was not raptured isn't necessarily proof that the rapture didn't happen, because the rapture believers would say I would definitely be left behind, according to, because I don't believe what they believe. So
I always wonder how, and I ask Christians this a lot, and they'll never give me an answer. Like, so Jesus said, if you didn't take care of the poor, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and visit the prisoner, you would be the people on the left who would depart. Like, what do they do with that verse? You just like, oh, let's just act like that verse isn't in there.
I think in their minds, they think they do that because they send money to organizations that supposedly do those things.
Okay.
It's kind of like patting themselves on the back, or they just ignore it because it's not one of the more important culture issues. That sounded weird for some reason. Cultural. That's why that sounded weird.
Well, I guess they're like, I brought a backpack for the last backpack drive at church, so I'm good.
Right. They do these little things that make them feel like they're a good person, but it's not actually, it's not making change. It's like, or people like give 10% to their church and tithe to their church, and they think that's helping community because, they think their church is helping the community. And there are churches that do help the community, but it's, sometimes it's more for the show of it all than what actually is beneficial too.
I hear that from people a lot, that, conservatives give more to charity than anybody else. And I'm like, yeah, because you make big donations to your church to get a new sound system and more comfy pews and call it charity.
Yeah.
You get a tax write-off, but I don't think Jesus is calling that charity.
Well, and it's just the whole idea of, it's like putting a Band-Aid on the problem. Like they do enough things that in their mind are good, and they are good things, to kind of ignore the fact that they are in cahoots with like enforcing the status quo and systemic racism and systemic harm that the churches cause because, well, look, we look at these good things over here. We don't have to deal with that. It's just
Yeah.
enough to placate it.
And by the way, not knowing the day and the time, that's true of our show too, because we're now moving the timer.
That was a really good segue. I
Thank you.
just like the rapture, evangelical as you will not know the day or the time. For those listening to the podcast, we started the show an hour early, and then last week we had our show on a Monday instead of a Wednesday because Paul is being super kind, and every week is like, can we move it earlier for you? Because I think they've noticed me being a little grumpy. Also, I've told them I've been a little grumpy at how late our shows go.
And it is late, and you have 2 young children, and I know how life goes, and you're also busy with your work and all of that. So, so we're working on moving the time around a little bit. And so I can tell everyone, if you look at our website, I will pledge to every week put in on the schedule page, the events page at evangelicalish.com, what time we will be doing the live stream recording of the podcast. And you'll be able to know when to find us. And then you will know the day and time.
Yes, that we will actually give a sign in the form of a graphic on our social media to tell you exactly when we will be going live. But if you are just a podcast listener, you can just listen. And, maybe I'll surprise you and the show will go up on a Monday instead of a Thursday. But I think typically it'll still be Thursdays for the most part. But just keep your eyes peeled.
There you go.
Look for our signs. Well, we have an exciting guest tonight.
We do. And now I'm looking at what did I do with the bio? I can't find it. But Dr. Dana Hicks is with us, and he has written a book a while back called The Knot, which is a book about the history of marriage. And good God, I cannot find what I did with and my computer's freaking out. So I'm going to bring Dana up, the author of the book, The Knot, and also a new book coming out that is coming out soon called The Quest for the Thin. You're going to have to help me out again, Dana.
The Quest for Thin Places.
Yes. And it's
spirituality after deconstruction. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. So we have lots to talk about in that. Okay, now I found it. Let me just say, Dana, Dana received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Northwest Nazarene University, the Master of Divinity degree from Nazarene Theological Seminary, and the Doctor of Ministry degree from Beeson Pastor Doctoral Fellowship at Asbury Theological Seminary, and currently lives in, is it Purple, Arizona? Do we know what Arizona is?
Yeah, we're Purple. Yeah.
And
I love this. I just realized as you're reading that, I've got some good evangelical cred there.
You do.
I've got some deep roots. I was also thinking, when you're talking about the rapture, I have a theory too that maybe the rapture did happen, but only like 2 or 3 people were worthy of being raptured away, and nobody noticed. That could be too.
I wondered if it was the day, and then Jesus looked down and he was like, "Nah, never mind. There's got to be a better time than this."
Or maybe there's been so many rapture predictions at this point. Maybe each one, Jesus just took one, take one at a time. Like, it's less noticeable that way.
That's
like
true.
When they say thieves,
and eventually
just a little bit of money. Yeah.
Well, you have a new book coming out, but we thought this topic of marriage is a really interesting one. You have a book that you've had out for a while that is really, really good called The Knot, Knot, and it's about the history of marriage and how maybe we can look at marriage differently. So talk to us about how you came about this book, and what we all know is marriage is between one man and one woman, and you can only have sex in the missionary position, and otherwise you're not godly, correct?
That's chapter 6. Yeah. This whole journey for me kind of started years ago. Somebody recommended a book to me by a woman named Stephanie Kuntz, who's a historian out of Evergreen University in Washington. And she wrote a book called Marriage, a History, and just traces marriage from its origin in the agricultural revolution up to today. And it was so fascinating to me to think about how different marriage has been over the ages, and how really what we call marriage is really a reflection of some idealized version of the 1950s, and a lot less about what marriage has historically been. Marriage, romantic marriage, as she calls it, has only been around for a couple hundred years. And so the idea that we would find our soulmate, fall in love, and live happily ever after monogamously is really an idea that's only a couple hundred years old. And so evangelicals in particular, I was telling Paul as we were talking about this, now that I'm writing this book on deconstruction, I think this book really should have been subtitled something about the deconstruction of the evangelical marriage or something like that, because it's really it really is a way of rethinking marriage in terms of not just what was handed down to us, but thinking it in different terms of how it functions in our lives, how we can reimagine it to be the most loving sort of institution that it could possibly be. And that's in the spirit of Jesus, who says, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." The ultimate deconstructionist Jesus was, who would take
Yeah.
take things and say, yeah, that was okay for a time, but can we reimagine this to make it even better? Can we do this even better? And I think that's that was kind of the hope of the book, is to sort of reimagine marriage in a new way, and to allow, and maybe not be prescriptive in that, but to give people permission to reimagine their own marriages in a new way.
That's cool.
You talk about romantic marriage being a new thing. It's also kind of a privileged thing, but the history of this, you talk about it coming in the agricultural revolution. And was it really about owning a woman so she could pump out some farm workers for you?
That's probably a crude way of describing it, but yes, in essence, yeah. It wasn't until the agricultural revolution when we quit being hunter-gatherers as a society and quit living in small bands and tribes. And once we discovered that you put a seed in the ground, it grows into a plant, and you didn't have to wander all around the world to try to scavenge for food. The world began to change, and all of a sudden property became really valuable, and ownership came about for the first time. We began to think about ownership as human beings. And once we started thinking about ownership, we started thinking about how do I pass on this inheritance to my children? And once we started asking that question, then it became really important to know who my children really were. And so marriage became sort of evolved as this way of knowing who my children really are and who deserves my inheritance of property. So the invention of property and the agricultural revolution really was the invention of marriage. And so, like many things, we spiritualized it, and it became a spiritual issue because it was important for the stability of society at that time in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, to have stability. And so marriage became an important part of what that meant. So people got married throughout history. The main reason people got married throughout history was to survive. I mean, they didn't have the luxury, the privilege, I like that word, Paul, that you used, that we have, that, most of us don't worry about, whether or not we're going to make it to the next day or not. We have other problems, but food usually isn't one of them. And so marriage no longer functions for us as a way to sort of survive. We look for different things. And in the book, I trace, there's a guy by the name of Eli Finkel who's done a lot of research on this, and he traces the history of marriage and kind of intertwines it with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and says, early on in marriage's history, we thought of marriage as like, how do I get these sort of basic human needs met? And then once we sort of got that figured out, then we started to ask more of marriage. We started to ask, well, how do we what happens if we actually like the people that we're married to, And that was a new question in human history, like, what if we like the people, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? And
marriages were arranged, right?
Exactly. Before that, they were just arranged, and marriage was way too important an institution to just sort of leave it up to the hormones of teenagers. I mean, it was something that was so important for the survival of your clan that you arranged marriages that were strategic, that had watering holes for your animals in that other family in the other village. And so marriage, again, formed a strategic function. And now, of course, as time's gone on, we ask different questions. We eventually invented romantic marriage and said, what if we married for love? How interesting would that be? And so that last 200 years is the first time in human history we began to ask that question. Now, that's not to say that people before the last 200 years who were married weren't in love. Some of them certainly were, but that wasn't the reason they got married, and it wasn't the reason they stayed married. It happened to be a lucky byproduct at best. So when we began to ask a different question of marriage, of like, we want to marry for love instead of other reasons, it was probably a good thing, and it's a good thing to be that privileged. But it also put a lot of weight on marriage. So that means now I have to actually love the person I'm married to, and not just in a put up with them kind of way, but in a actually care about them and want to be with them kind of way. And Eli Finkel argues in his book that he says that we've freighted marriage with more and more and more weight. Now we want a marriage not only that we love the person, but somehow we become self-actualized through them.
You complete me.
Yes, the Jerry Maguire quote, right? That's what we're looking for. We want somebody who will look us in the eyes and say, "You complete me." That somehow, our missing person is out there, and if we find that person, that will somehow, they'll fulfill all of us. Well, that's a lot to ask for another human being, and so Eli Finkel says, "Is it any wonder the divorce rate's so high? I mean, our expectations are through the ceiling on this," and so. There might be another way to think about marriage and to reimagine marriage that might be healthier for all of us in this.
Well, I'm curious to your take on growing up in evangelical culture, and I'm sure it's still this way. There's this emphasis that marriage, like, is like the goal, especially for young girls. Like, you're going to grow up, you're going to find a godly man, you're going to marry that man, then you're going to be a good godly wife. And that's kind of, I mean, yeah, you could have a career and do all that stuff first, but marriage, like, so much emphasis was on finding the one. And I remember being taught that, like, God has the one out there for you. And like, they would tell us, and like my little missionettes small group and girls are like, you can write down what you want your future husband to be. And like, we would write prayers for a future husband, because we were like, I know my future husband's out there. I don't know who he is yet, but I'm praying. And like, a lot of it would be like, I pray you stay pure for me. Yeah. So much.
And you did that while the Royal Rangers were playing basketball outside.
Oh yeah. Or archery or something stupid. And they're like, we don't care. We're boys. But yeah, what's your take on the one? Do you believe there is one person out there for each of us?
Wow, and it's not just evangelicals; it's sort of the rom-com complex too. Industrial complex that kind of promotes that sort of notion that there's that one magical person out there that if I just meet that person, then they'll fulfill every need that every want and desire that I possibly have, and I'll never, have a desire for another person ever again. Which, when you say it out loud, it's pretty ridiculous. But it also creates a lot of problems. You marry somebody, and then it gets hard, and then you begin to say, well, maybe they're not the one. Maybe I picked the wrong one. Maybe I got confused, and this person tricked me into marrying them. And it creates that, we think that somehow marriage isn't going to be work then, that it just magically kind of all happens. And I think that's the double danger of that, is that when it becomes difficult, then we become disillusioned with our own particular marriage, and that. It's kind of it's a pretty ridiculous notion that I think has caused a lot of harm over the years, for sure.
And you use some of your own experience as a backdrop to the book. Can you tell us how your experience enlivened what you had to write in this? If you don't
I got
mind.
married. Yeah, no, I'll tell you about it. It's funny. I was going to share a personal story that just happened a few weeks ago, and then I thought, I'm not sure I should share that. But I've been married twice and divorced twice. And first time I got married, I was 23. She was 21. The state of Idaho barely trusted her to drink beer, but they would be glad to give her a marriage license. That was no problem. But yeah, we lasted 18 years and had some kids together, and that's a whole nother story. But yeah, we were very, very hardcore evangelical. You know, I was a pastor. She played the traditional pastor's wife role, all that kind of thing. But yeah, that fell apart. And then, the second one, it was just a nasty decision on my part, and it's a long story. But what I was going to tell you about, I think that's interesting, April, when you're talking about, you know, women in particular who grow up in evangelical culture, who have this sort of romantic notion of, you know, finding the one and all that. Well, you know, I mean, I've been unmarried now for several years, and I really like my life. It's really great, by the way. And this is I've been kind of jotting down notes for, you know, I'm trying to finish this other book, but I've been keep running across all these really interesting things to write about marriage and relationships. And so I've got the Knot Part 2 kind of outlined already. I'm calling it More Naughty, but
I like it.
But anyway, so one of the things that experiences that I had recently. So I'm dating this woman. We've been dating for a couple years now, and we both agree she's never been married. She has no evangelical background, which is so refreshing. It's so nice. Doesn't have all that baggage and whatnot. And so, you know, she tries to understand where I'm coming from on different things, but is kind of like, okay, whatever, you know, on some things. Well, so we on her birthday a few weeks ago, we went out and we had a little too much to drink. Not very evangelical, I know. And so we had already had this long discussion about, like, we'll never get married. We're just never going to get married. There's no reason for us to get married. You know, it's weird to date somebody, by the way, and have them read a book that you wrote about marriage. That's really kind of a weird deal too. But so we've pretty much agreed, oh, we'll never get married. We'll never get married, you know. So we go out for her birthday. I have too much to drink. And I say to her, you know, someday, baby, I love you so much. Someday I'm going to buy you a big old ring. And she says to me, shut the F up. You are too drunk to say things like that. And so we ended up processing
the relationship with marriage, right?
Yes. So we ended up talking about it later. And I say to her, and I have this sort of epiphany. It's like, I grew up in this evangelical culture where I just assumed every girl just wants to get married so badly, you know, that this is like their life calling, like April, like you're talking about, that, you know, they went to Sunday school and wrote out prayers to their future husband kind of thing. She didn't experience any of that. She's just like, this is weird, dude. Just stop it. Shut up.
I have that like out of body experience every once in a while when I meet people and become friends with people that don't have a religious background or an evangelical background, and I say things or reference stories from childhood and thinking they'll laugh, and they're just mortified instead. Like, wait, what?
Or something, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I tell my therapist things from my childhood and laugh, and she's like, that's not funny. That's horrifying.
I know. My therapist has done that too, and I'm like, laugh with me. Like, this is how I cope. We have to laugh about it or I'll cry. Please laugh.
So Dana, out of your experience with marriage, in the book you talk about how you know, we wouldn't get on an airplane that had a 50-50 chance of surviving.
Yeah.
50-50 is kind of has always been this kind of basic stat of marriage survival. And you're looking for ways for us not to have to go through so much divorce in this country, perhaps.
Yeah, and divorce. Yeah, I think the divorce rate's actually going down a little bit, and I think
because marriage rates are going way down.
Because people are getting married a lot less, you know, and that's part of it. And part of it is that I think that what used to be a deal breaker in the past, you know, I think people are beginning to sort of recognize that this sort of notion of you know, this person being the one, and they'll fulfill all of my needs and desires and wishes, and that I'll isolate myself from everybody else in my life. People are beginning to realize that's kind of ridiculous, and I think they're starting to, I think rightly, begin to see their needs being met through friends and family and places that, you know, that are probably a healthier place. So they're not freighting so much on their partner, their romantic partner in that. So
I think too, there's such a, I think evangelical culture, I'm sure that this is across the board some too, but especially in the church, there's such this hyper focus on lust. Like you get married to squash your lust. But I think in a lot of ways, they've just equated lust with just basic human attraction, to where like when you do get married, if you find someone attractive that is not your spouse, you almost have to go into like full on repentance mode, or you put up all these barriers to make sure that you don't find that person attractive, when there's nothing inherently wrong with finding another human being attractive. I remember when Beecher and I first got married, we were married like a year. We were running a small group for newly married couples. And one of the girls, one day we split up. We had like the husbands and the wives. And I was with all the girls, and we had a brunch, and this one girl was just like confessing her little heart out. Like she was so upset. She was like, I can't go to the mall anymore with my husband because every time we pass Victoria's Secret, I know he's looking over there, and I just can't. I don't know how, like, we
lust?
just right, or like the models, and I'm like, even back then, I was like, that seems like a very stupid reason to not go to the mall with your spouse. And I don't know, I just felt like I never felt that way with Beecher. Granted, Beecher is non-binary and is never. Their thing is just different. But yeah, Beecher and I, we're like open in our marriage about who we find attractive, because we're like, and being attracted to someone isn't wrong. And I think it's not plausible to assume that you're never going to find other people attractive for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I mean, it literally makes you feel like you're watching a movie and your partner says, "Oh, do you think she's attractive?" And you're like, "Oh, no. She's, you know," when clearly these are some of the most beautiful people who ever lived.
I know,
No, I don't.
Looking at like Charlize Theron or, you know, Paul Walker, or, you know, some famous
They're too
movie
skinny
actor.
for me.
Yeah,
They're not my
no,
type.
sorry. Yeah, not attractive. They're not attractive. No, not at all. They're hideous.
And it's the idea that it has to last forever. I know, Dana, some of what you talked about in your book are some ideas about how we look at marriage differently, perhaps, and maybe do this a little bit better than traditional marriage, as we've been told.
Yeah, and I try not to be prescriptive in the book to say, you know, well, this is the wrong way, you know, but this is the right way. Here's the correct answer, kind of thing. Recently, I came across this great book by a guy named Peter McGraw called Solo, and I'm not sure if you've heard of this guy or not, but
No,
man, I wish I had read his book before I wrote mine. And actually, some of his book, I thought, did you get that from my book? But man, I lost my whole train of thought. What was the question you asked me, Paul?
Yeah, well, it was kind of a long-winded one, but
so designer.
How do we avoid the
the
dangers of the disaster of marriage falling apart by looking at it differently?
Right. So he has a phrase he uses called relationship design, which I think is a great phrase. You know, that we create designer relationships. That, you know, the way that we need to think about relationships is that human beings are different and unique, and everybody is. And when two unique human beings come together, they're going to create a unique relationship. And we shouldn't think that this is a cookie cutter kind of thing. That there are ways of understanding and doing this. And so so that's sort of the abstract. In the concrete, what that looks like, you know, in Peter McGraw's book, he talks about how you know, some people are what do they call it? Non-cohabitating marriages, you know, where they're married but they don't live together, or they have separate bedrooms, or, you know, there's, you know, they just find that they get along a lot better when they don't live together, you know. So they may be financial partners, they may be legally married, but they don't actually live together, and
Or a co-parenting.
right, or they, yeah, they may be co-parents or, those sorts of things. And there's just a million different ways to think about, how do we handle finances? How do we handle children? How do we handle, our aging parents? There's a million different moving parts in a marriage that you can negotiate and talk about, what are the things. I know lots of people who got married who have separate checking accounts, for one reason or the other. One of the partners is like, you're horrible with money. I don't want to mix my money with yours. And so they, keep their finances separate, which, if that works for you, do it, and I think this is what I'm sort of driving at, is beginning to reimagine what that might look like, to think of marriage not as, a one size fits all, but thinking of it as finding our own unique designer relationship.
Yeah, I think there's just so much pressure on what a marriage is supposed to be. And, you're taught that if you find the one, it's like, yeah, you might hit some bumps in the road, but it's supposed to be easy and it's supposed to be fairy tales and butterflies and you'll have it forever. And that's just not the reality of what marriage is.
It seems like we're literally teaching that idea. In evangelical, it's like the two become one. So we are looking for some completion in marriage, where now I'm learning it ought to be two complete people who come together to share, I guess, an ecosystem together. Maybe that's a better way to look at it.
Yeah. If you're looking for someone else to complete you, you're going to run into all kinds of problems, I think.
It's not fair to the other person, is it?
No, definitely not. Yeah.
I like Jay's
I don't want
comment.
to be that for somebody else.
Yeah, Jay said in the comments, if you are not friends, you should not be married. I think that's definitely some truth to that, because you can find romance and sex anywhere, but that's not the long-lasting part of, I think, successful marriages that last.
And it's interesting because one of the things I remember from your book, Dana, is that married people generally are, when asked, are lonely. Like, we're lonely in marriage because we start to lose outside relationships and such. Is that right?
We isolate. Yeah, because we have this notion that, oh, now that I'm married, I have this person who's going to be my everything, and they're going to be my best friend, and my companion, and my, they're going to watch football games with me, or I don't know what people's perceptions are, but then you find out pretty quickly that that's just way too much to put on anybody else, and then you end up isolating yourself from friends and family that you previously had, because you think that this is where, in this one relationship, is where it's all going to be.
And then I think some people get in a cycle of, well, this is not my forever person because it's not perfect. And so then they leave and they try to find the other, they find someone else that they think, this is my forever person. And then they find, they run into the same problems because they're trying to find fulfillment in somebody else instead of, like, not to be evangelical cringe, but I used to always hear too, like, once you're content with Jesus, then he'll send you the one, but you've got to be content with yourself first. I'm like, but I think you do need to find some contentment with who you are as a person before you can rely on someone else.
Oh, for sure. Why am I being reminded of the meme right now? Like, Jesus, come quickly, and you're like, do you know what that sounds like? So that was a funny joke to me, not anybody else, I guess.
It took me a second to pick up what you were putting down there, Paul, but I'm tracking with you.
You finally got there. All right. What we also talk about is traditional marriage. Focus on the family. Really, this traditional marriage was there ever such a thing as traditional marriage of husband, wife, 2.3 kids, and a white picket fence?
Yeah, probably 1953, but yeah, And I like, when I hear that phrase now, I think, traditional as compared to what? I mean,
Right.
traditional compared to 1950, traditional compared to 1525. I mean, or 3000 BC. I mean, marriage has evolved, and there's no. I mean, if you want to be real traditional about marriage, have an arranged marriage and have a farm together. I mean, that's traditional marriage, and then don't even like each other, and then the kind of the notion too. I think even in the Middle Ages was, you didn't actually love the person that you were married to. You fell in love outside with other people and had relationships with other people that were what we would call romantic relationships with other people. But you wouldn't. Why would you want to be in love with the person you're married to? That just makes things complicated. I mean, that was the mindset. So yeah, I mean, polygamy, frankly, is probably the most common form of marriage in human history. So if you want to get traditional, let's be polygamists. That's really the most traditional form of marriage. And if you want to look to the Hebrew scriptures, I mean, not only is polygamy, pretty common in that, but I mean, they have things like the Levirate marriage, right? If your wife dies, then your brother, or if a man dies, then the man's brother has to marry the woman. I mean, there's all kinds of rules like that. If you want to get real traditional, I mean, those are the rules, right? I mean, let's jump on board with them. But I think, and again, I have a chapter in the book in which I kind of unpack the try to rethink the theology of it. And part of it is that what I argue is that in theology and ethics, the way to think about it is that form always follows function. And that phrase comes out of architecture, and Frank Lloyd Wright, who actually is from Phoenix, Scottsdale area. He came up with that phrase, and he used to always, he would say, look at the trees, they're all different, but yet they're all the same. They have the same sort of function, but their variety is infinite, and so this is the way that we need to think about ethics, that a person's actions, what we do, ultimately isn't sort of the measure of what's right and what's wrong. What is the ultimate measure of ethics is our ability to create an environment of love around that, for the well-being of other people. So that may look different in a variety of situations. And so in marriage, I mean, the form a marriage takes is much less of an important question as the function of the marriage. Is it a loving marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that if you're a parent, you kind of know that intuitively, right? The way you love your kid is different all the time. When they're little, I mean, you love them by changing their diapers and feeding them and waking up with them in the middle of the night and, holding them after a nightmare, those sorts of things. When they get older, it looks different because they're different. The form changes, but the function is always the same. Our motivation of loving is always the same. I have 3 kids, and they have a variety. I mean, there's different times. Sometimes they need a hug. Sometimes they need some encouragement. Sometimes they need advice. Sometimes they need a kick in the pants. I mean, they have a variety of forms that my love takes for them, but the function is always the same. Is that I love them and I care about them. And so form always follows function in ethics, and form always follows function in terms of the way in which 2 human beings relate to each other in a romantic relationship or in a marriage relationship. What you actually do, what it actually looks like, is a much less important question than how is it functioning for these people. And so, when it comes to issues like gay marriage, to me, this is just, it's a non-starter, right? It's like, what kind of plumbing you have? Who cares? I mean, that's such a non-important issue in comparison to the form. Isn't nearly as important as the function of how does this function for you two? Do you care about each other? Do you love each other? Are you bringing out the best in each other? Then that's what matters more than anything else. And so even, these arrangements of, do we have a shared checking account, or even when we talk about questions of monogamy, I mean, form and function, what is it that works best for us, not what is the cookie cutter sort of.
Well, and you talked about it in the book, how missionaries would go to other places and say, no, one man, one woman, and then realize in some societies it's very kind for a man to have multiple wives because the women don't have access to the economic system. So that's how they survive.
Right.
And so yeah, we've got to understand where culture is.
Yeah, our Western culture, we just assume, oh well, why would a guy want 3 wives? Well, because he's horny. Why else would you? I mean, you want to have sex with them, right? But in their culture, though, it's totally different. I mean, that's not their motivation. Their motivation is there's a woman who is marginalized from the community, who can't make it on her own, who doesn't have access to the things in a patriarchal society that she should. And so by a man marrying her, it's an act of compassion and mercy, not an act of lust. And so, again, what's the form we look at the form and we say polygamy, what? But how does it function? That's a better question, right? How does that function in that society? What does it mean in that society?
This is just making me think in real time about just how self-centered and like we are the main character in our own minds, like evangelicals, but really Americans in general, but how self-absorbed you have to be like one man, one woman, when you're completely ignoring that there are currently cultures in the world that just like you said, that marriage is more of a means of survival or just a different way of life. And one man, one woman isn't practical over there. Does that mean they're all abominations? No, it's different cultures. But in our mind, it's like, no, American evangelicals is the original Christianity. And Jesus came down and was like, go to church on Sundays, have 3 to 4 songs of worship, do an offering, and then have a 45-minute sermon and be out in an hour, 15 minutes. It's like, that's but in our minds, like, this is how church is. This is how Christians are. Like, we're so like self-absorbed. Like, we think, I mean, even when I was evangelical, I was like, I knew my way was like the one true way. And I completely discounted the fact that not even just other religions, but there are over 46,000 other Christian denominations like presently. But I was like, nope, I've got it right. I have it right. Like, how like narcissistic are we as a culture?
It's also ignoring the fact that there are more women than there are men. So how do you do one man, one woman? Somebody's left out of that that merry-go-round, so to speak, or musical chairs or whatever the game is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be some better ways to do this thing. And what I think is important about what you're talking about, Dana, too, is I think in some ways all of us are always asking the question, like, what if I can't take care of myself at the end of life? Who's going to be there for me? And so I think finding that relationship is really important. But the idea of like, well, if we're not still totally madly in love anymore, we have to break up, really sets a lot of people on a course for fear of not knowing who's going to be there for them at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which again, we've created this system in which one person is our everything. And so part of the tragedy of divorce is exactly that when we lose that one person who's everything, we've lost everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we've set ourselves up for a lot of heartache by I have a friend who works at Chase Bank, and he's big into investments and whatnot. And he's always talking to me about like, diversification. You got to have a diverse portfolio, And I think the same is true in relationships, right? I mean, if you have all your investments in Apple stock and the Apple crashes, you're sunk, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a diversification, if you have multiple friends, if you have multiple close relationships and friendships and family and people that pour into your life and care about you, then you're less worried about those sorts of questions of like, I got to hang on to this relationship even though I'm absolutely miserable because they're my everything. I've got nothing.
Interesting. Robert in the comments says polygamy is linked with all kinds of societal dysfunctions. I think in some ways that is a result of kind of the repression we put around these issues, sexuality and things. And so, yes, if you're going to have broader relationships, you're going to have to be really good at communicating to each other and being honest. And I just don't think we teach each other how to do that. We just like, okay, be married, and no matter how much you change through all the years, you will continue to be madly in love, and all of these things. And so I understand what he's saying in the comments, but I also think if we just learn to adult better and be less repressive in our mindset around things, we could have better conversations and survive some of these things.
Yeah.
Well, I also
I'm
think
sorry,
there's some. Sorry, go ahead. You can go.
Oh, I was going to say, can you read that comment again, Paul?
He says, I'm sorry, but polygamy is linked with all kinds of societal dysfunctions.
I would say too, with polygamy specifically, you find that more in very high patriarchal societies. Like polygamy and polyamory are two different things. Like I think
Yeah, maybe we should be talking polyamory.
Like I think polyamory is more the partnership, the Western version, where like polygamy is one man, multiple women, where women are treated, in my opinion, and maybe I'm wrong, but treated more as property, like in the biblical times where, men had several wives and then concubines, and women were basically glorified breeders to an extent. So, but I do think there's,
we've jumped right back into the temptation. I think that it's easy to fall into, and again, and it's the form and function understanding, right? Does polygamy as a form, is it sometimes oppressive and unloving and dehumanizing? Of course. Is monogamy as a form sometimes oppressive and dehumanizing and awful? Of course.
Yes, that ideal 1950s marriage gave everything to the man. And even if he beat his wife, it's like, that's their business. Don't talk about that.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to get past is like, it's not asking the question, what form does the marriage take, but how does it function? And so with our friend who made the comment, I would agree. At times, polygamy is awful for society, and it's terrible. And there's also times, and again, I've done a lot of work in Africa, and I've come across this where you see it's like, I'm not going to condemn this. I mean, I'm not saying it's the best option, but it's the best option they've got, of a lot of bad ones. And so, again, it's not so much the form as it is, how does it function in their society? How does it function for them? Are they providing the best possible loving environment, that's possible? Sometimes polyamory is a very unhealthy sort of way, but it isn't polyamory itself. It isn't the form, it's the function, right? Again, we look at these sorts of things and think, well, try to make simple sort of cookie cutter, comments about all these different forms. And again, I'm trying to avoid that in the book to say, oh, here's the new form, because that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say, find your form, find the form that's the most loving form. That's really my hope in that. Yeah, April, I was thinking too about your comment about this notion that like we have this idea that we're right and everybody else is wrong kind of thing. And I wrote this letter to the evangelical denomination I used to be a part of. They passed this statement on human sexuality, and whatnot, and it was everything you'd expect it to be, of made them feel really self-righteous and whatnot because it looked a lot like them. And I realized as I read it, I thought, you wouldn't ordain half of the characters out of the Hebrew scriptures, with this statement. I mean, you would kick them out of your church, So, I mean, if you're more self-righteous than the people in the Bible, I mean, that's a red flag, I think, because they don't fit neatly into your box, right? And again, because they're trying to create forms, they say, oh, if we just find the right forms, then all the problems will be solved.
Yeah. Jane Smith in the comments, and I think it might be the same Jane that actually started supporting us a couple weeks ago or last week. So thank you, Jane. And we were going to read out some names earlier and we totally forgot. But maybe we can do that at the end of the show. But Jane was saying how women in particular are told that marriage is our highest calling, but also that women need to be content as singles, and that any grief at being single is completely disenfranchised. And I do think there's something more pointed at women than men. Like if women complain about being single, they're bitter. But if men are doing it, they're just like, oh, you just need to, your wife's coming, you're a good, godly man. And there's just like kind of, and even just the way that churches treat singleness. Like you have all these events for marriages and family events. And at the churches I had been to, they would maybe have one singles group. But if you went, it was just like, who can stack the most chairs contest by a couple like creepers in the corner who clearly like have, they've been on all the dating apps and have just failed. But yeah, it's just that there's this idea that like, if you're single, there's something wrong with you. Like the church almost treats single people as less than because they haven't found their completion, like they're incomplete, which is harmful in and of itself, because just like you're saying, like form and function, I think it's also completely like people can be happier single in the long term and find more fulfillment in not being partnered with somebody else.
Yeah, and doesn't Paul say something like that? I mean, we believe that Paul's writings are part of the New Testament, right? I mean, we can agree on that.
Yes.
I mean,
Some
he
do,
pretty much
yes.
says, dudes, if you have to get married, if you're going to burn with lust, fine, give in. But if you're strong like me, be single, right?
Right.
So I'm Pauline and biblical in my singlehood, and I'm sorry that you people are so weak in your flesh and have to be married. But yeah, I mean, that's the irony in it too, right? I mean, if you really actually read the Bible, I mean, it doesn't hold marriage that high in nearly as high a standard as we do. It mentions it in passing at best, I mean, it's like, oh yeah, and you can get married too. I mean, it just isn't that it doesn't find it that interesting, I don't think.
And that fact is interesting in that you constantly hear people say marriage is, the backbone of our society. We give incentives for getting married in our tax code. And there is now a big freak out on right wing of not enough women want to get married anymore. They just want to have cats and have corporate jobs, and they're panicked over it. In fact, one of my evangelical cringe, it's just interesting how it has become this truism that family and marriage is what makes America great again, I guess.
Yeah, and again, this book that I'm about 3/4 of the way through, this Peter McGraw book on solo, I think has been so eye-opening for me. And of course, he's not writing from an evangelical perspective at all. He's just writing from a cultural perspective and sort of recognizing this huge shift culturally from people recognizing that there's a lot about getting married that isn't always helpful or good, especially for women. Women's life expectancy goes down when they get married. Men's goes up. And that should be all you need to know about who's usually more happy in the marriage. In fact, Peter McGraw has this really interesting take on the Peter Pan story, because the Peter Pan story is usually spoken of. We think of Peter Pan syndrome of the boy who doesn't want to grow up and be a man. And we think of, single men who, don't want to grow up and they're immature and whatnot. But he looks at the story. I find this really interesting from Wendy's perspective and the Wendy syndrome. And what he says is that what often happens is that women take in immature men and they enable them to remain immature. They dress them. They tell them what their social activities are going to be. They feed them. They do their laundry, they clean up after them, and they allow them to remain infantile sort of human beings in a marriage situation. I found that really interesting critique of marriage and men and women. And yeah, that marriage isn't always helpful for men either. They may live longer, but they can often become immature in those sort of environments as well.
I saw a tweet that reminds me, I can't remember who had tweeted it, but it was something along the lines of, you can ask a lot of men to describe attributes of what they believe an ideal wife would have. And a lot of times what they describe sounds a lot more like a servant or a slave than a partner or a spouse. And I think that alone is just very telling of the expectation in a lot of these evangelical churches, but even just society in general, that in a patriarchal world, the wife serves the husband, the wife fulfills the husband's needs. I mean, and just look in history, how many people, famous wives do we know that have multiple husbands in polygamy? It's never that way. Of course, I don't know what woman would want multiple husbands, but I digress.
Yeah, I went and this was a few years back. I was talking to this woman who had been, she's single and she's in her 40s probably at that time, and she was like, here's the thing I've noticed about dating men in their 40s. She says, the stereotype is that women are out there and they really want to get married and they're really hungry to get a ring kind of thing. And that men are like, whoa, they're commitment phobic and they don't want to, they don't want to commit. She says, my experience is exactly the opposite. She said, the men I go out with, they want so bad to have a woman in their life that'll clean up after them and cook for them and do their laundry. She says, it's a good gig for these guys. This is what they really want. And they want to get married so bad and so fast. She says
it's like having a mom 2.0.
Yeah. And I think it's, with things like the gender pay gap and things, it's to keep women trapped and needing to be married. And it makes me think of the show The Sopranos. In these mob communities, there was even a name for it, a gumar. Like every man had a woman on the side. The wife knew it, but the agreement was, you take care of me and don't put this other woman in front of me or in front of others where we see it. And that's part of the deal. And I just think a lot of what marriage is, and with incels and all the things we're seeing in culture now, is men think women owe them something, that and women need to be trapped into that posture so that they carry out their duty, so to speak. And it's so funny that in evangelical circles, we literally teach this as a rule, and all of that's got to change and just come back to some reality of the world now, I guess.
Yeah. Dana, we're coming close to the end of our time and we still have some evangelical cringe videos to get to. So can you tell everybody where they can find you and where they can buy your book?
Yeah, you bet. I'm online, danahicks.blog. I'm on Twitter and Facebook and all those kinds of things. And obviously the book's on Amazon, amazon.com. Search for Dana Robert Hicks. Oh, there it is. Yeah. The Knot, KNOT, is the title. Until the sequel comes out, The Naughty. What was the title?
The Naughty.
Yeah.
Getting naughty.
Getting
and
naughty.
We can tell everybody that on Amazon you have to search The Knot and Dana Hicks, because there's a whole bunch of, otherwise you're learning how to tie knots in the book.
Yes, and there's a marriage workbook I saw for people who are getting married and things like that. Yeah, but, yeah.
And tell real quick about the book you're working on. Do you have an idea when it's coming out? And tell us a bit about the premise of it. Yeah,
this one, the second book has been it didn't come out quite as easy as the first one, and it's been a lot of work. But I think it's great. It's just about it's kind of semi-autobiographical about deconstruction and reconstruction. And kind of asking those questions of what is it that we really want, when we talk about spirituality. What I've noticed, a lot of evangelicals that deconstruct take all that dysfunction and ways of relating to each other and to spirituality and try to reconstruct with those unhealthy habits, and then sort of rethinking those as well as sort of not just belief structures, but the way in which we approach truth and things like that. But hoping it comes out September, October-ish. It goes to the editor in June, the line editor, and hopefully the process will be over the summer. But yeah, I'll shoot you an email when it's done.
Yeah, and we'll have you back then, because I think so many people are trying to think of what does spirituality look like now and things like that. So that'll be a really interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, Evangelicrin.
Yes, before we go there, because I did say we were going to read the rest of those names, I'm just going to read a few names just as a shout out. Thank you for those that it's just $4.99 a month, and it just helps us pay the few little bills that we have to keep the show going out there. Thank you to Cheyenne and Jane and Michelle and Kate and Brian and Justine. And I think those are a few that we have right now. But hey, if you would like to help us, just support us. You can go to evangelicalish.com, and no pressure. We still love you either way. And I am terrible at asking people for help. So call.
You did it very, very well. That's very nice.
Thank you.
All right. Do you want to hit our first video, April?
Do you want me to do it? Do mine? The one
Go
I
for
had?
it. You start.
Okay. So hold on. Okay. So I have to, for those listening on the podcast, I'm going to narrate this because it is a text video, but this is an ad that Trump posted on his Truth Social account on Monday, April 8th, the day of the eclipse. So I will play it and I will read anytime there is text on the screen. Here we go.
I feel like I'm going to throw up in my mouth.
All right, there's a sun. It says the most important moment. In human history. All right, you have people wearing eclipse glasses looking at the sun. We're back to the sun. It says, is taking place in 2024. Now we see what looks like a moon coming to be in front of the sun, but it's slightly not a circle. Now people are cheering. More people with eclipse glasses. They're excited. What is it? Oh, it is a silhouette.
I see where this is going.
It is a silhouette of Donald Trump. There he is. Trump is the moon. And of the sun, it says, we will save America. Now people are dancing. They're smiling. They're happy. They're looking in the camera. And make it great again. There's the Okay,
So it looks like it was a little hard to hear you in some of that, April.
Sorry. Okay. Well, maybe I'll just cut this for the podcast if it was if you couldn't hear me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was basically just Trump being the moon covering the eclipse, saying it was the greatest moment in history. It's coming in 2024 when we will make America great again.
It is absolutely not a cult. Absolutely not a cult.
It
So
also,
Trump
like
is the
the
one
people,
who blocks the light of the world from coming into the world. Is that what? That's what I took from that.
well, also the greatest moment in human history. Like Jesus, would Jesus not be to a Trump supporting evangelical? Would Jesus, like time on earth, crucifixion, resurrection, wouldn't that not be the greater part
It's a close
of
second.
history?
It's a close second.
Close second to Donald Trump in 2024.
Well, Jesus died on a cross. Trump is going to make America great again. Which of those is better?
One country on one planet in 1 year. Yeah.
Yeesh. All right, I have one. This is for those listening on the podcast. Charlie Kirk, who is, we've talked before, and I'm a very nonviolent person, but he just has a really punchable face. But this is Charlie Kirk talking about women voters.
A 32-year-old young lady who went to college, who has a nice apartment, a corporate job, and cats. You're a Democrat voter, right? They've been sold a lie through culture, through media, that you basically have to go pursue this corporate trajectory and that men are always the problem and suppress your biological impulses. A lot of them are on birth control too. and birth control like really screws up female brains, by the way. They will give young ladies birth control for pimples, for acne, to control their moods, their period, and it creates very angry and bitter young ladies. Then that bitterness manifests into the bitter party. I mean, the Democrat Party is all about bring us your bitterness and we'll give you free stuff. Young ladies present a great opportunity. How do we win them over? Once they have kids, they become like right wing about by 20 points. And so the issue is that we're not having enough kids in this country. We're not.
What?
Wow.
When you have kids, you become 20% more right wing. I had kids and I went to the left. So, Charlie, I am not your demographic.
That's because you take birth control, perhaps.
I don't actually.
Oh, okay. All right.
To be fair,
None of my business, but
none of your beeswax. Paul.
None of my beeswax.
I'm always stunned at the confidence of a white male talking about gynecological things with no education whatsoever. The hubris of his confidence just blows my mind.
Well, and there's that whole trope I mentioned earlier that single women are bitter. Like I know a lot of single women and they are happy and they're joyful. They're not bitter.
They're some of the happiest people I know.
Oh my gosh.
Where does he come? And by the way, yeah, this guy didn't even graduate. He dropped out of community college. He has no bona fides whatsoever. But where does he come from saying, in essence, birth control makes a woman vote Democrat? I mean, it's just insane.
I actually am kind of speechless. I don't understand that. It's not logical. I mean, I should not expect logic, but still, like he's just pulling stuff out of his ass. Like, what is he? I don't even. I mean, I have been on birth control in my life, and when I was on birth control, I voted Republican. So, another knock on that logic.
Well, and again, it's like, medicine that helps a woman feel better during her menstrual cycle. How horrible can that, how terrible that they prescribe those drugs to women. It's like, guys, you're not even keeping the quiet part quiet anymore. You just really don't have a lot of regard for women.
Well, I think it's just so patriarchal. They want women to shut up and have babies so they can keep the population going. And I think there's this old idea too, that when a woman becomes a mom, then suddenly she wants to stay home and, which there's nothing wrong with that.
Vote Republican.
Right. But it's not this, like, women we are more than breeders. We can have children and a career. We can have children and still have friends and a life. And I think men hate these types of patriarchal men hate the idea that they cannot control women. And in their mind, the way that they can get back to controlling women is to get women to just pop out a bunch of babies and hopefully get married to a man that will control him. And I think that's why there's such this push to one man, one woman in the Bible, because that is a tool that patriarchy uses to control women. How are you controlling women in a queer relationship? Who's the head of the household? In a gay relationship, it completely throws patriarchy out the window. So instead of, looking at the scriptures and thinking logically and looking at like, hey, there's actually good fruit in this queer relationship or in this polyamory relationship or in this single relationship, like it doesn't compute with what they need to do to control women. And that's what I think it boils down to.
I think you're right. And I can't think of the word now, but focus on the family and the traditional family idea. The underlying foundation of that is we need to get white Christians to have more babies. It's a replacement theory idea of, people of color are having more children than white people, and they're going to take our place and take over. And so it's terrible.
Beecher made me laugh. Beecher said in the comments, the only way that they could control me was by coming out non-binary because it made me put my guard down. It's like, you're not the head of the household anymore. Anyway.
Nice.
Jokes all the jokes. Okay, do you have another video?
I have another if we want to do one more.
We can do one more.
Okay.
It's not so late now. Look, I have energy.
Yeah. This is Mark Robinson, who is the Republican candidate for governor in North Carolina. This is a candidate for governor of a state of the United States making this speech. Here we go.
The movement in this country, if there's a movement in this country that is demonic and that is full of the spirit of Antichrist, it is the transgender movement. And this same people gonna tell me, you need to believe in global warming. And then they tell me, follow the science. Follow the science. You don't even know what gender you are. What do you know about science? Dragging our kids down into the pit of hell, trying to teach them that mess in our schools. Tell you like this, that ain't got no place at no school. 2 + 2 don't equal transgender. It equals 4. You need to get back to teaching them how to read instead of teaching them how to go to hell.
Okay. And he said, shut up, you don't even know what gender you are. Yes, they do. Trans people actually do know what gender they are, and they're trying to tell you what gender they are. You are the one that doesn't know what gender they are and trying to tell them that they are not what they actually are. Oh, that gets me all riled up.
Good point.
Stupid. Also,
I
2
think
+
he was
2
just-
doesn't equal transgender. Who has ever said that? That's such a stupid. That was so dumb. Sorry, Dana. Go ahead.
No. I'm sorry to interrupt. We got this little delay, and so it throws me off when you take a breath. I thought you were done. I think this guy was in my town just like last week, like a couple days ago. He's been making this tour to go to what are they called? School board meetings all around.
Oh yeah.
And so he shows up, and I only know this because there's a woman who's a friend of a friend that was talking about this, and she's on the school board in Mesa here, one of the suburbs. And he showed up, and I mean, it was a 6-hour school board meeting. It just went on and on and on. And they tried to get them to stop, but of course, then they're, oh, you're persecuting us. You won't let us have our time. And then, he does all these dramatic things and tries to get thrown out. And then so that he can, and they're filming the whole thing because they want to get thrown out. There's this big stunt. And then of course, you threw me out because I'm black, kind of thing. And then it gets into all that. It's a whole thing. It's all performance art.
It is. And then I know so many people who believe every word of what they're being told of that. And people believe, a 6-year-old can walk into a doctor's office, particularly in California out here. A 6-year-old can walk in, a 6-year-old boy can walk into a doctor's office and come out a girl. It's unbelievable that doesn't happen. They've got everybody convinced, all this crazy stuff. And Trump this week called late-term abortions executions. I mean, it's unreal what people are believing and buying into these days.
Yeah, well, it's an election year, so I feel like it's just going to get crazier.
I'm working with Rocky Roggio about maybe doing a bus tour with 1946, the movie, and we were talking with some people from Florida about some things to do in Florida, and afterward, I'm like, I felt like I was talking to people, behind the Iron Curtain in the 80s. They're like, come help us. We're.
Florida.
It's a really odd season we're in.
Ron de Sanctimonious. Yeah. Meatball Ron. Oh.
Well, Dana, it was good to have you on. And yes, let us know when the new book is out.
It's so fun to hang with you guys. Thank you so much for the invite.
Thanks for being here and for giving us all this information about marriage. Lots to ponder. And go get Dana's book. I'll put links to where they can find you in the show notes as well.
I appreciate it. Awesome.
Thank you, Dana. And thanks to everybody hanging out with us and for moving times around with us and all. You guys are truly awesome, and we enjoy talking to you every week. So thank you, guys. We'll see you. What do we have next week? Do we remember?
I was just thinking. I don't remember. Be on the lookout on our social media.
On social media and at evangelicalish.com.
Yes, and we will let you know when our next. Hold on, I'm trying to open it up. Right
We
now.
have some huge, awesome guests coming up. We've booked Dan McClellan.
Oh yeah, next week is the same time. We're going to be doing 8 p.m. Eastern next Wednesday, which is 5 p.m. Pacific.
Yeah.
And we are having Jason Kirk, who is the author of Hell is a World Without You, which is a novel about basically growing up evangelical in the 90s and 2000s, and it's pretty funny. So it'll be a fun time. So join us next week.
Very cool. All right. Good night, everybody. We love you all.
Good night.